Thank you very much. The election of Barack Obama opened a new chapter in the history of the US presidency and transformed the visual practices of the office. In 2009, just a few months after the inauguration, the White House announced that it would use the social media photography site Flickr to share official White House photographs with the public. Now, previous administrations had employed White House photographers to chronicle each president's time in office, primarily with an eye toward posterity. But what Obama did was something quite different and really unprecedented. They decided to turn official White House photography into a real-time social media strategy. Today, well into Obama's second term, the White House Flickr photo stream contains more than 6,000 images, offering viewers a carefully curated, behind-the-scenes look at the President of the United States. By communicating his visual image to the public in ways that largely bypass the filters of traditional media, Barack Obama has changed the history of presidential image making. But what I think is interesting is that he is also participating in a dramatic transformation in the history of photography itself, and that is the digital revolution. But Obama is not the first president to help shape citizens' experiences of photography. Throughout US history, presidents have participated in photography as public subjects of photographs, as consumers of photographs, and indeed, once in a while, producers of them. In fact, one might argue that photography and the nation grew up together. Photography first emerged as a public art with the introduction of the daguerreotype in 1839. The first sitting president to be photographed was William Henry Harrison, who famously died after 1 month in office. But before he died, he purportedly posed for a daguerreotype, which has since been lost to history. The earliest photographs we have of a sitting US president are those daguerreotypes of James K. Polk, who was photographed numerous times while he was in office in the late 1840s. But we have even older photographs of former presidents. For example, these two daguerreotypes of John Quincy Adams, made in 1843, may be the oldest existing photographs of a US president. We also, interestingly, have evidence of what Adams thought of this new process, because he wrote about it in his diary. After one sitting in what he called the photographer's shadow shop, in his diary, Adams pronounced the daguerreotype likenesses of my head as all hideous, and he concluded that these daguerreotype likenesses of his head were too true to the original. Now, if we wanted to, we could chronicle these presidential photographic firsts all the way up to the present day. For example, Barack Obama is the first US president whose official photograph was made with a digital camera. And earlier this year, Obama he became the first president to sit for a 3D digital portrait in which his head and torso were scanned, and that created a digital life mask, which was then produced using a 3D printer. Welcome to the 21st century. Now, what interests me the most about these moments of presidents and photographs isn't so much the firsts. What I'm really interested in is how the very existence of images like these tell a story about the history of photography in the United States. Across more than 175 years, presidential photography has participated in, and I would argue helped to drive, a steady and fundamental shift in the way that citizens experience public life. And I'll argue today that this shift is one from character to connection. Beginning with George Washington, yes, that George Washington, and then moving to Abraham Lincoln and Barack Obama, I'll show that what began nearly 90 years ago as the use of the camera as a tool to picture character has now, in the 21st century, transformed into the use of the app to perform connection. And as you'll see, the presidency has played key roles in this transformation. Now, if you know anything about the history of photography, you know that it is impossible for there to have been photographs of George Washington. Washington, after all, died 40 years before the invention of the photograph. But we do have photographs of George Washington, who emerged as a subject of early photography almost as soon as the instructions for the daguerreotype made their way across the Atlantic in 1839. Obviously unavailable to be photographed from life, Washington's image nevertheless circulated in images of him in portraits like this one and also busts. So ironically, daguerreotypes of George Washington are some of the first presidential photographs that we have. So here are a couple of examples. What you see here is a daguerreotype made in 1847 by John Adams Whipple. And this is a daguerreotype of a very famous painting by the artist Gilbert Stuart. This painting is known as the Athenaeum painting, and one of the reasons it is famous is because it was famously unfinished. Similarly, the Boston Gallery, Southworth, and Hawes photographed the same painting in the early 1850s. It was actually pretty common for photographers to make daguerreotypes of works of art in this period because they wanted a way for people to see them if you couldn't see the painting in real life. But I don't think it's a coincidence that photographers chose images of Washington specifically to photograph. Barry Schwartz's research has shown that for most of the 19th century, George Washington was the visual icon of the nation, the national father, the moral shaper of the national character. But it wasn't just Washington's status as a national icon that fostered the impulse to photograph him. Throughout the 18th and into the 19th century, portraits were believed to communicate information about one's moral character. Well before photography appeared on the scene, popularly circulating ideas of the time suggested that one's appearance, especially one's facial appearance, offered direct evidence of one's morality. And even more importantly, if portraits had the capacity to communicate character, then it followed that they could provide models for emulation. So a citizen strolling through a public portrait gallery in the 1840s and 1850s, like those run by photographers in large cities on the East Coast, would look at photographic portraits and supposedly learn something about how to be a citizen merely from viewing them. So if photographs communicated character, and if portraits were supposed to function as models for emulation, then it made perfect sense to make photographs of George Washington. Most interesting of these early photographs featuring Washington are daguerreotypes that juxtapose portraits and busts of Washington with real-life people. And scholars such as Keith Davis, Laura Wexler, and Marcy Dinius have suggested that these kinds of Washington images tapped into the conventions of theater to provide kind of allegorical tableaus that would help citizens understand how to engage with the nation's icon, George Washington. This daguerreotype made by Southworth and Hawes in the early 1850s features a young woman gazing at a portrait of Washington. And in doing so, she invites the viewer to gaze along with her and perhaps reflect along with her about the man's greatness. A similar daguerreotype dating from the mid-1840s pictures what looks to be a mother and a daughter, and the daughter's gazing down upon a print that rests in the mother's lap. This is a print of George Washington. Photographer Gabriel Harrison earned public acclaim in 1845 for this allegorical portrait of his son, who of course was named George Washington Harrison. And Harrison made a similar daguerreotype 10 years later of his daughter with what I believe to be a different bust of George Washington. And these images depict the Harrison children as loving proto-citizens, literally wrapping their arms around the father of the nation. Such images illustrated Washington's status as an icon and emphasized his role as moral leader of the nation. In a terribly overwritten poem inspired by Harrison's daguerreotype of his son, Eliza C. Hurley wrote these two verses. The poem has many, many verses. These are two of them. Look up, 'tis Washington. Oh, fix on him thy gaze. His noble, his heroic mind filled nations with amaze. Strain every nerve to reach the mark, the height to which he soared, who proved the glory of his day, by the whole world adored. The writer urges the child to look up, to not only see, but to emulate George Washington. So to photograph George Washington then meant not only to recognize his patriarchal greatness, but to recognize the requirement for us as the daguerreotype's viewer to aspire to that same character, to strain every nerve to reach the mark. Now, I don't believe that it's a coincidence that the impulse to photograph George Washington appeared at precisely the moment when the generation of the Revolution and the early Republic was literally dying out. Washington, Adams, and Jefferson were long gone by the 1840s, but James Madison's widow Dolly lived long enough to be photographed by Matthew Brady, and in fact, she was a very influential woman about town in Washington, D.C. in the 1840s. Photographers flocked to the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee, to try to photograph him before he died. And you saw earlier the photographs I showed you of John Quincy Adams. In photographs like this, the bodies of these citizens from the founding period serve as a kind of poignant link to this revolutionary moment, to this moment of the new republic. And photographs of Washington and citizens like these provided a kind of memory of the nation's founding and provided guidance about what it meant to be a citizen. Now, it's important to note that these kinds of images did so in the context of other more contemporary photographs of political leaders, artists, and literary figures in the mid-19th century. Photographers in Washington, D.C. and around the country, most notably Matthew Brady, regularly exhibited portraits of those whom Brady called, in a famous book, Illustrious Americans. And what Brady and his fellow gallery owners would do is they would hang photographs of political and literary figures, celebrities essentially, in their galleries, which would draw visitors to stroll through and look at the portraits of these famous American citizens. Ideally, supposedly, these portraits would provide models for citizens to emulate. These relationships between citizens and their photographed leaders persisted to the end of the 19th century, and perhaps nowhere are the complexities of this idea of photography as character more vividly illustrated than in the public response to an early photograph of Abraham Lincoln. So let's talk about Lincoln. In 1895, McClure's magazine reproduced for the first time in public what we now know to be the earliest known photograph of Abraham Lincoln. It was made in Springfield by Nicholas Shepard, probably in 1846 or 1847, and to viewers of 1895, it showed a Lincoln that they had really never seen before. Previously known photographs of Lincoln dated really only to about the late 1850s, which was well into Lincoln's public career and middle age. So this Lincoln, a younger, well-groomed, middle-class gentleman, seemed to take people by surprise. He certainly didn't seem to look a whole lot like this Lincoln, the more familiar, later bearded portraits of Lincoln's career in Washington. In an effort to drum up interest in the photo, the publisher of McClure's very shrewdly sent around advance copies of this photograph to lawyers, politicians, academics, and those who had known Lincoln as a younger man. And indeed, many of those people wrote letters to the editor to describe their responses to viewing this photograph in the magazine. Several claimed that they would hardly have recognized the Lincoln that they knew in later years, while others actually fondly recalled, oh, this is the Lincoln I knew in Springfield. And one person very famously said, wow, I never saw him with his hair combed before. What they all had in common, though, those who wrote to the magazine, was that they claimed to see in Lincoln's face clear evidence of his good character and his future greatness. And one respondent even went so far as to suggest that this photo proved that the Civil War was just. Here's what he said. Had it been merely a war of conquest, I think we can see in this face qualities that would have been entirely inconsistent with such a course and would have rendered it, to this man, wholly impossible. So for this writer, Lincoln's face shows a character incompatible with the pursuit of a war of conquest. Therefore, the war must have been fought for right reasons. Only if we understand that powerful link between character and appearance that I talked about earlier does a statement like this even begin to make any sense to us today. But for viewers of the time, it would not have been characterized as strange. An anonymous writer put it this way in 1900 in Methodist Review magazine. The natural and customary use of language is to express one's thoughts, and equally, the habit of the face is to reveal the spirit. The face no index to a man's nature, no indication of what may be expected of him. As well, say the appearance of the sky is no criterion of the weather. Everybody knows better. Responses to the Lincoln photograph serve, I think, as a particularly vivid example of how citizens learned to treat photography as a tool for communicating character. This image is a photograph of the actual daguerreotype, which is housed in the Library of Congress. So according to these letter writers, the photograph showed that Lincoln was just and honorable. But that's not all they had to say. Some letter writers went a step further to argue that the photograph revealed something not only about Lincoln's character, but about the nation's character. They said that this photograph showed us what an American was supposed to look like. And Lincoln, they said, was in fact the first real American. Merrill Peterson has said that the idea of Lincoln as the first American was a common theme in the late 19th century. And people who made this claim often supported it by making reference to Lincoln's visual appearance. And Lincoln's physical appearance was an extremely popular topic in the Gilded Age. If you wanted to publish an article in a magazine, all you needed to do was propose to write an article about Lincoln's face, the way his body moved, anything about his physical appearance. People were very, very interested in this. And the reason was they wanted to claim Lincoln as a kind of real American character who could say something about the direction that American identity was going. So many people argued that Lincoln's long and lanky frame and his fabled rough frontier ways, his uncombed hair, for example, that these communicated a distinct and recognizable Americanness. And even Lincoln's personal secretary, former personal secretary John Nicolay, got in on the act in an article called Lincoln's Personal Appearance, published in 1891. He wrote that Lincoln's head was, quote, neither Greek nor Roman, nor Celt, nor Low German. So if Lincoln was none of these, if his head exhibited none of these qualities at all, of any other national origin, then by the process of elimination, he must simply be authentically American. Several people who wrote to the magazine made similar claims, and they argued that the Lincoln photograph, this photograph, revealed Lincoln to be a distinctly American type, a new man whose appearance indicated a new stage in American characterological development. Perhaps no writer was as explicit as T.H. Bartlett, identified in the magazine as a, quote, eminent sculptor who has made a scientific study of photographs and life masks of Lincoln. In his letter to McClure's, Bartlett observed that the photograph suggested the rise of a new man. He wrote, quote, it may to many suggest other heads, but a short study of it establishes its distinctive originality in every respect. Bartlett concluded that the McClure's photograph of Lincoln was, quote, the first picture representing the only new physiognomy that the United States had contributed to the world. So this photo not only showed Lincoln's character, it showed the American character. Why did people care so much about this? At the end of the 19th century, Americans were wrestling with social and cultural changes such as the aftermath of the Civil War, the abolishment of slavery, rising immigration, and the United States' increased political and military engagement with the rest of the world. So one possibility is that this idea of Lincoln, the first American, appealed to those who were anxious about the fate of whatever they wanted to be a real American identity. And Barry Schwartz puts it this way. He writes, Lincoln was not elevated because the people had discovered new facts about him, but because they had discovered new facts about themselves and regarded him as the perfect vehicle for giving these tangible expression. In the 1890s, Americans were searching for an authentic American identity. They were searching for clues as to the national character of its citizens at the end of the 19th century. So 30 years after his death, 50 years after this daguerreotype was made, they put this Lincoln photograph in the service of that search. Today, it seems pretty impossible to imagine anyone saying such things about a photograph of Barack Obama or any president. Yes, public conversations about presidents still turn on issues of character, and certainly critics of Obama have a lot of things to say about their feelings about his race or his Americanness. But they don't necessarily tie these things directly to his photographic image. Today, the locus of these conversations about character has largely shifted elsewhere, away from photography and into other contexts. Now, as for photography itself, photography has undergone rapid change, especially as we'll see in the last 15 years or so. And as we've moved over the last 175 years from the daguerreotype to the digital revolution, the ways that presidents engage with and shape our experiences of photography have changed a lot. Generally speaking, we can date the digital revolution in photography to 3 events. The development of digital cameras, which began, depending on how you calculate it, in the early 70s, but really didn't ramp up until commercially available cameras began to appear beginning in the late 80s. The second event would be the development of the image processing software Photoshop, which first appeared on the scene in 1989. And then finally, and I think most importantly for my purposes today, the rise of cell phone or mobile photography beginning in the late 1990s and then moving especially rapidly into the early 2000s, fueled especially by the introduction of mobile applications, also known as apps. And just to give you a sense of what kind of time frame is here, the Apple App Store debuted in 2008. So this is pretty recent stuff. This infographic from Dowager Designs nicely illustrates the dramatic and complete shift from analog to digital photography since 2000. So in 1990, pretty much all analog. In 2000, little tiny bit digital, pretty much analog. 2011, really not any analog. Today, probably every single person in this room has at least one camera on their person right now, and the capability of taking and sharing a photograph via a mobile application almost instantly. In 2012, Fortune magazine reported that 10% of all photographs ever made were made in the year 2011. Today, depending on whose data you trust, and that is a great question, Instagram has 75 million users per day, and Facebook users upload somewhere between 250 and 300 million photographs per day. As this infographic tells us, today we snap as many photos every 2 minutes as humanity did as a whole in the 1800s. That's a whole lot of photographs. To continue, here's how photo apps describe themselves. Instagram invites you to capture and share the world's moments. Facebook invites you to connect with friends in the world around you. Snapchat is for real-time picture chatting. Sharing, capturing, chatting, connecting. Certainly these echo the feel-good Kodak moments of the past that many of us remember, but they also point to a fundamental transformation in our relationship to photography. In 2012, Wired magazine writer and curator Pete Brook argued that photographs are no longer things, they are experiences. So if that's true, then we may need to ask different questions about presidents' engagement with photography than we have asked in the past. For example, today we might need to ask what it might mean for the president to be not only a public subject of photography, not only a consumer and occasional maker of photographs, but primarily a maker and sharer of them. As we've seen, the earliest modes of presidential photography offered viewers portraits that citizens believed reflected not only an individual's character, but also the nation's character. In these earlier periods, the tool was the camera, the mechanism for communication was the portrait, and the product, if you will, was character. Today, in the era of digital photography and mobile apps, we see that fundamental shift from thing to experience that Pete Brook talked about. Today, the tool is the app, the mechanism for communication is the shared image, and the product is connection. President Obama's engagement with photography both reflects and shapes the ways that citizens today are experiencing this transformation. I opened my talk by pointing out that the Obama administration began in 2009 using the social media site Flickr. Now, Flickr embraces the ethos of everyday photography. Anyone can create an account, upload photos, tag them, share them. From my perspective, the utter genius of the White House Flickr site is that it builds a living, changing historical record of the presidency using the deceptively transparent ethos of social media. And nobody has to wait for that lovely presidential library to be built down the road from us here in Chicago to be able to view the pictures. The sharing of official White House photos via social media like Flickr does a couple of things. First of all, I think it normalizes the view of the presidency as accessible in a behind-the-scenes way, and it presents us with a more human president who seems to be just like us. He hugs his wife. He plays with children. That's in honor of Halloween yesterday. He loves his dog. The photos posted to Flickr are selected by editors in the White House photo office who choose images to share with the public on Flickr from the upwards of 5,000 to 20,000 photographs made by official White House photographers every week. And just as an aside, the Federal Presidential Records Act mandates that they save every single digital image they make. Nothing can be deleted. I do not envy their storage issues when they make a transfer of these data when Obama leaves office. What we get on Flickr then is by no means transparent or unfiltered. It offers the public a view of the president and the institution of the presidency that the Obama administration very much wants all of us to see. But Flickr isn't just sweet humanizing photographs of the president with his dog. I've argued in some earlier research that one theme of the earliest White House Flickr photographs, those made primarily in the first 2 years of the administration, really seemed to be that of authorizing Obama's presidency. Photographs visualized him in official spaces like the Oval Office and tied him visually to mythic presidents in a way that seemed designed to cement the image of our first African-American president as firmly part of a history of the presidency. In addition, White House images posted to Flickr have also occasionally functioned as a kind of visual news release. The most famous example of this is this 2011 photo of Obama and other administration officials in the Situation Room viewing the raid on on bin Laden's compound. So the White House Flickr uses conventions of social media to invite engagement and connection with the president and the institution of the presidency. But it also works as a kind of public archive or image resource gallery for those who want to share, circulate, or remix what they find. In other words, just because the White House puts it on Flickr doesn't mean it has a whole lot of control over what happens to it. Sometimes White House Flickr photos, for example, become viral sensations of their own, such as this one of a bored child in the Oval Office. He quickly became known as Faceplant Kid. He'll love looking at this picture someday, won't he? At other times, the photo stream serves as a source for themed slideshows, listicles, and other clickbait that recirculate the photographs out of context, just as a part of the broader popular culture landscape. There are many, many examples of this, and two that I will offer today are 15 adorable pictures of Obama with kids, and 4 more years of Barack and Michelle being adorable together in the White House. That's a very long title. In the last couple of years, the shift to performing connection has become even more pronounced as the Obama administration has embraced the world of the app. In 2013, official White House photographer, the chief photographer, Pete Souza, joined Instagram, noting that he was encouraged to do so by the White House Digital Strategy Office. What made Instagram different from Souza's regular professional photography was that on Instagram, Souza began posting many images that he had made on his iPhone. I suspect that the choice to use the iPhone wasn't only just a personal choice, but rather kind of embodies the shift from the camera to the app and moving more toward an emphasis on the shared image that I talked about earlier. Indeed, in an interview with Time magazine, Souza observed that his Instagram work would be for more for photos, quote, away from the primary action of the president. He said he wanted to give viewers something more fun and personal than the photographs we post to Flickr. The president himself is participating in this shift to connection in a couple of ways. And the first of these is that he is increasingly drawn in as a photographic subject of selfie culture. Self-portrait photographs, of course, are not new. In fact, you may not know, this is the first selfie made in the United States. This is the first daguerreotype portrait made in the United States, and it is a self-portrait by and of photographer Robert Cornelius. Selfies are typically, today, self-portraits made with a smartphone, shared via a mobile app, and constructed to show one's participation in an event or construct one's public persona, or usually both. Obama participates in selfie culture both as a subject in photographs with regular citizens and also with other elites. Now, it's cool when he poses for a selfie with Vice President Joe Biden. Please note this was Biden's first selfie. He's very proud. But it's a little more vexing when Obama does it with other world leaders in the selfie scene around the world made at Nelson Mandela's funeral. Never one to miss an opportunity to connect, the White House has begun to mobilize the new photography of connection in the context of particular policy campaigns. The first of these was a BuzzFeed video released earlier this year where Obama used a selfie stick and he parodied selfie culture in order to encourage young people to sign up for the Affordable Care Act. These are actually, these little GIFs or animations are from a longer video, and it tells this whole story about how Obama just really wants to look good, but also we should all have health care. More recently, with great fanfare, the president took over the White House Instagram feed on a trip to Alaska to promote climate change policy. And I love that he announced his presence on Instagram with the cheery, "Hey everyone, it's Barack." The White House wrote this on its blog, and I thought this was a really interesting statement. Quote, "President Obama is seeing the effects of climate change firsthand, and he's sharing it directly with Americans across the country. For the first time ever, the president is taking over the White House Instagram and personally taking the photos, exclamation point, to give you a look inside the trip." Then, moving from sharing and connection to something maybe like policy action, The White House encouraged users of Instagram to take a look at what the president has posted so far and double tap his photos if you agree we need to take action on climate change. Now, those of you who know Instagram know that the double tap is what you do on your screen to indicate that you like a photo. And when you do this, a little red heart shows up. So scholars of politics might take issue with the idea that liking something on Instagram constitutes really taking action on climate change or anything else. But what I think is interesting is here we see the photography of connection being put to some kind of policy use. On his own Instagram feed, Pete Souza photographed the president making photos and jokingly termed him my competition. But in the new photography of connection, the images themselves mattered less. What mattered more was that the president was not only seeing firsthand the effects of climate change, but that he was sharing it directly with Americans. So this then seems to be the transformation. While citizens used to gaze into their president's eyes to discern something about individual and national character, now we see through the president's eyes to experience connection. And I want to draw your attention on the screen to the third comment down that illustrates this nicely, I think, where the commenter on Instagram, a photo that Obama made himself, says, "So cool to see what you see and read your comments." So what are the implications of this shift from character to connection, at least for us as citizens and for photography itself? What I can say is this. Photography doesn't only show us things to look at, it teaches us how to see. The daguerreotype fostered a certain way of seeing that was grounded in even older beliefs about portraiture that taught citizens how to navigate public life. In the 19th century, navigating public life meant, in part, living with a conception of character as visible in the appearance and therefore communicable via the photograph. 21st century viewers navigate public life differently, in part by sharing experiences visually, the app as a tool to foster connection. Now, we're really only beginning to come to terms with the implications of this dramatic transformation, both for photography and for ourselves. But I at least think that studying presidential engagement with photography helps us to recognize the norms that may drive the times, whether those are times past or our own times, and that can help us reckon with the moment that we're in today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My questions have to do with going back to some of the early photographs of the presidents. Clearly, they seem to be used in galleries, you said, I imagine to sell pictures. Is that correct? And how were they then communicated to the average person and or used politically, for example, in newspapers? When did they come into use in newspapers?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So a couple, just to summarize briefly the question, how are images of presidents used, kind of how did average people see them early on, and then at what point did we have newspapers become a vehicle for that? So the first part is the traffic in photographs kind of happened right away, but you had to be relatively well off and in a place where you could access them early on. So the book I showed, the shot of the Matthew Brady Gallery of Illustrious Americans, was a beautiful book that did not, in fact, contain photographs. What it contained was exquisite, gorgeous engravings of daguerreotypes that had been made by Matthew Brady. So one of the ways that people would have experienced photography would have been through, one could say, translation into engravings. Later, as the 19th century moved on, you began to be able to publish photographs directly in newspapers and magazines. You saw the Abraham Lincoln image was essentially published in a magazine. It looks like a photograph rather than an engraving. That didn't start to happen until the 1880s, when a process known as halftone was invented, and that was a process whereby you could more or less directly translate a photograph into print in a way that allowed you to circulate images more widely. There's one other art form, a popular art form that I would want to insert here, which I didn't talk about today or show you any examples of, but which was really important, and that was stereography. If any of you had a Viewmaster when you were a kid, or my mom, who was born in the 1920s, remembers stereographs in her house, cards that you would put into a viewer, they're about this big, and things became 3D when you looked into the viewer. And the stereograph emerged starting in the 1860s and lived well into the 20th century, and they became a really kind of mobile, popular media entertainment form. You could buy sets of images to show what it would be like to travel to Shakespeare's Stratford-upon-Avon, and you would look at all of the images. Or you could buy sets commemorating Civil War battlefields. You could buy sets commemorating the assassination of Lincoln, the assassination of Garfield, et cetera. So the stereograph was another way that regular people would have consumed images of presidents in that period.
Thanks. Do you have any global context so if Obama is particularly out in front relative to other world leaders today in his use of photography for connection and ultimately policy impact?
That's a really great question. I haven't investigated, for example, the social media practices of other world leaders, but it would be really interesting to see. My completely uneducated guess would be that probably he is pretty out front in the context of what we know about the way he ran his campaign, first in 2008, and then the way that they've adopted various social media strategies and broader communication strategies overall. But I don't know for sure, and that would be a really interesting project to look at, particularly because of the way that the photography of shared connection really is enabling a kind of global circulation of images that certainly we've always had, but we just haven't necessarily had on the scale that we have it today. Thank you.
You didn't mention the introduction of television, let's say mass television in the early 50s, and how that affected people in terms of seeing at home whatever the networks intended to show about politicians, as opposed to previously just hearing people on the radio.
Yeah, television's extremely important in the larger media landscape, and particularly in the context of the presidency. So the history of campaign image making, the rise of the campaign film, which now is almost a kind of throwaway, but in earlier decades was a really important way to introduce narratives and stories about presidents. The notion, the idea behind the scenes that I think the White House Flickr photo stream embodies, I think very much connects to these developments in other media, I think television especially, where the idea is to humanize the president, to begin to understand them as a family. We didn't have official White House photographers. The first official White House photographer was hired by LBJ. John Kennedy arguably had Cecil Beaton and others that he invited into the White House for that very public, behind-the-scenes, private access kind of photography. So there probably is an interesting connection to think about the rise of television and the rise of these other ways of picturing and still photographs presidents. And that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you. What is the implication of the White House only using White House photographs and not allowing Newswire or AP photos to be published or be used in official capacities?
The Obama administration has really wrangled with the media on this point, and what started to happen, there's kind of two things that I thought were really interesting about this. So essentially one of the things that happened was I think it was a couple of years ago now, the White House Photo Corps, so members of the news media who work in the White House and are photographers, finally just said, we've had it. You are telling us meetings are private, and then you're slapping up pictures on Flickr, and they don't seem to be any more private than the kind of stuff we used to be able to shoot, that we used to be allowed to shoot all the time, the meet and greet, the handshaking in the Oval Office, et cetera. And the White House really had to kind of backpedal and say, well, we aren't really restricting your access, but well, maybe we kind of are. And ultimately, the way it sort of played out was they they kind of quietly made nice and then backed off of some of the restrictions that they had put on. One other thing that I noticed kind of about this relationship very early on when the White House Flickr photo stream emerged in 2009, and I was paying very close attention to it because I was writing about it and doing research about it, I started to see White House photos made by Pete Souza or other official White House photographers and credited to them being used to illustrate news stories about the president, almost kind of without notice. So you would see there'd be a photo about how the president was getting along with his advisors, and the New York Times would not publish any other photo that they had made of the president. They would publish a White House photo. And so there's two things there. One is, I think they started using Flickr as an image source because it was pretty great visual images that illustrated what they wanted to show. But I do also think that this was kind of the beginning of that wrangling with the press and the relationship. The last point I'll make, and I don't really know what more to make of it than this, is that Pete Souza, who has been the official White House photographer for the whole Obama administration, he also worked in the second Reagan term, and Pete worked in Chicago, covered Obama's various campaigns. Pete Souza is a very well-respected photojournalist who now happens to be working for the White House. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting when members of the news media and the photographers associations were criticizing their access to the White House is they were all saying, we think Pete is great. We're not criticizing Pete. We're not criticizing the quality of his work. We are saying that as members of the news media, we need more access. And so there's something about that kind of inside-outside relationship that I find fascinating. I don't really know what to make of it, but it's something that I noted at the time.
Thank you. Would you comment on the times when the press photographers actually collude with the administration? I'm thinking of the way they photographed FDR and also Jack Kennedy. They never showed him in pain or suffering and so forth.
Sure. FDR is really interesting because one of the parts of the project that I didn't share with you all today is I've been working on the rise of 35mm photography, which is a form of photography that most of us in this room probably practiced and know and kind of became the mode of photographic communication for much of the 20th century. And in the late 20s and early 30s, that form of photography, which at the time was known as candid camera photography because it was very small and portable compared to earlier cameras, this arose, and there was this kind of moment in the early 1930s, before Roosevelt was in office and before the rise of fascism in Europe, where photographers were kind of walking into political gatherings, making really candid, interesting photos of diplomats deliberating with one another and not being kind of on stage at all, but very behind the scenes. And that mode of photography was kind of this fleeting moment that was replaced almost immediately by a kind of collusion on the part of members of the press. In the FDR context, of course, there was a concerted interest in hiding his physical disability. And then, of course, in Europe, there was a clampdown on all kinds of expression, including image making of the sort that had been going on before then. So, yeah, I think, I don't know a whole lot about the history of the various ways that journalists hid or covered up for people like JFK or FDR, but I will say that there is a kind of really complicated inside-outside relationship with the president. So those who are covering the president are kind of inside, but they don't really have that insider access. And then the people who are hired as White House photographers who do have that insider access, their job is not really to be a member of the media per se. Their job is to now be, working for the winner. And so there are a lot of tensions at play. And I think for those of us who look at these photographs or encounter them in public, in your newspaper or magazine, or in a talk like this, I think it's just good to be aware that these images were constructed for a certain purpose that I may or may not be aware of, but I can learn something from them as filtered through my own experience anyway.
I think of Obama as sort of a younger president. He's got teenage daughters, so some of the selfies and things make sense to me. But do you ever see this turning in the other direction? Like, depending on who the next president is, do you think that they might just say, I don't really want to be, you know, kind of photographed in this manner, or do you think that this is just the way it's going to be from now on?
That's a really great question. I think partly a lot of this image making and the digital strategy, you might say, that Obama's using is tied to the moment, that we're in this moment where this is what our media landscape has become. This is what photography is now. So to a certain extent, that they are both instrumentally trying to take advantage of it, and that images like those that I've shown you are circulating broadly and more popularly. You know, maybe if it weren't Obama, this would still be happening. I'm not sure. I do think that, I'm not sure if there'll be necessarily a backlash, but what I do see is I just see this kind of series of shifting norms over time. So I don't want to kind of claim a technological determinism here, but when we have this moment where suddenly there's these new technologies, and what's a selfie stick, and what is this, and what is that, and what are we doing, and what's Instagram, and why does Obama need to be on it? You know, when all of these questions come up, it's this moment where we're really navigating this moment of change. And presidents don't necessarily drive that moment of change, but they're definitely participating in it, and they're always going to have to participate in it. I think Obama and those who are working on his media strategy are trying to drive the train as much as they can because they're really savvy, and because they know they have a photographic president, they have a photogenic president, a photogenic family, they have somebody who essentially came to office and was elected on the basis of really, really skillful communication of all kinds. So it would be crazy for them not to take advantage of it. But, you know, depending on who comes along, I don't know. You know, if Instagram had appeared when George W. Bush was president, I don't know what they would have done. If Hillary Clinton's elected president, I'm not sure what she would do. One thing you can do for fun, all of you politics watchers, is if you're on Instagram or curious about it, start following all the presidential candidates, because that will kind of start to tell you what's happening. And I think it was the Washington Post several weeks ago did this kind of mini analysis of what's on everyone's Instagram feed. And the interesting one to me was that Hillary Clinton is doing a lot of photographs of herself in early life, so it's very much about kind of, this is my personal narrative, this is who I am as a person, this is my story, look at this cute picture of Chelsea trick-or-treating when she was a child, et cetera, et cetera. So one way that we could maybe try to predict what a president after Obama might do would be to look at what folks are doing in a campaign.
We have time for just one more back here.
Thank you. Could you comment on privacy issues? Is there no privacy with everybody, the official photographers, the Instagrammers, the people in the crowd? What do you see as the future of this issue?
In the context of privacy, I think for a president, we have to think about that public role. So the notions of privacy playing out for Obama are going to be very different than they would for you or me, presumably. There are definitely things, if you look at the White House Flickr photo stream, all 6,000 images that they've chosen to post, there are definitely things that you do not see. For example, you do not see, I don't think I've seen any, or if there are very few images of the family in their private quarters, of the children, especially early on, there were very few images of the children. I think that as the children have gotten older, there's a little bit more comfort level with them, you know, growing into teenagers and young adulthood now. In the context of privacy overall, I guess the question would be tied back to that notion of connection I talked about earlier. So if you are going to kind of buy my argument that the mode now is a mode of connection, then, and if as Obama, as president, you're going to try to use that instrumentally, then you need to maybe be willing to step back a bit from whatever a sharper definition of, you know, your private zone would be in order to make that connection. So when Obama posts things on Instagram, We're not getting a look inside his personal cell phone, but we're being invited to see something that he saw. So I think the privacy questions, as they play out in the social media landscape more broadly, are really interesting and complicated. And in the context of the presidency more specifically, we need to really think more about what that public role is and how that's changing. And maybe how we feel about it, right? The Nelson Mandela funeral selfie produced a lot of conversation because people thought, is this rude? Is it terrible? Well, then a picture of George W. Bush with Bono showed up, and well, maybe everybody was doing it. It wasn't really a funeral, it was a celebration. So again, these are moments really that we're kind of all navigating this moment of technological change. Thank you very much. I appreciate the questions.